Hi, welcome to Culturally Determined. I'm your host, Aryeh Cohen-Wade, and my guest today is Travis Smith. Travis, could you introduce yourself?
Happy to, Aryeh. I'm Travis Smith. I am Associate Professor of Political Science at Concordia University, where I teach political theory. And I have just recently released the book, Superhero Ethics.
Right, so that's going to be the topic of our conversation today, superhero ethics. So this is an unusual book, I think, in conception. It's really interesting. It's for people who grew up reading superhero comics or people who maybe just know who the characters are, because in the past 10 years or so, all of these characters have entered the mainstream in a way they hadn't during my childhood or your childhood. Can you kind of explain the conceit of the book and also why you decided that this was the book you wanted to write?
Sure. So, right. These characters, especially in the last, I would say 18 years since X-Men came out in 2000, but especially in the last 10 years since Robert Downey Jr. made Iron Man as big a pop culture phenomenon as a Luke Skywalker or a Harry Potter, a character that in my youth you had to be a comic book reader to know much about. And so the idea of superhero ethics is I took what I do at my day job, which is I teach politics. I teach old books. I try to communicate old ideas and old arguments to students in the 21st century in my classroom. And part of the challenge is to make those ideas interesting and relevant. And so I often make recourse to a lot of examples from popular culture, and in order to try to illustrate the points and make them more familiar. And thanks to the popularity of these movies, it's no longer the case that only the reclusive comic book collector knows who these characters are, but even the cool kids know who these characters are and their stories now. And so among the various kinds of things, whether it's music or internet phenomena, superhero stories can be among the things that are useful in order to teach my classes when I'm teaching ancient philosophy or modern philosophy, whatever. And I thought, I could try to apply this more generally. So it's not just for the undergraduates in the classroom, but try to reach a general audience of people out there. So this is a book that's not a book by a scholar strictly for academics only, and it's not just for students. It's intended for general audiences. I decided to focus on well-known, very popular, long-standing characters. The newest character I treat is Wolverine, who's still been around since the 70s, rather than more obscure characters where I would have had to engage in a lot of exposition and would have had to expect readers to have read, 10,000 to 100,000 comic books to get it. Instead, if you got a passing familiarity with the movies, I wanted to make sure the book was accessible to you, whether you're a real fan or just somebody who takes your children or your grandchildren to go see the movies. I wanted to write it in a way that would be familiar also when it came to the philosophical side of the book. So it wasn't, strictly academic discourse on ethics of a sort that you would only find in a professional journal that is, Greek to most of us in our regular lives, but instead try to discuss these philosophical subjects in a fashion that's also familiar to the general public, and try to combine these two things and try to make it a little bit fun along the way while engaging in some cultural criticism and reflection on ourselves and our society and the things we value and the kinds of people that we praise or the kind of people that we might wish we could be if only we were better or more powerful than we are. And so I took advantage of the popularity of these characters now, these movies, and thought I'd use them to engage in the exercise of cultural criticism in a different way than a lot of the other books that try to do that in a more on-the-nose, direct fashion, dealing specifically with policy and politicians by name.
Yeah, it's so the kind of the structure of the book is set up in a way that, well, I guess you talk about it explicitly as kind of like the kids in the schoolyard would say, like, would Spider-Man beat Batman, and argue it back and forth. And then there's also this comic book cliche that, like, the first time two superheroes meet, they fight each other through a misunderstanding of some sort before they realize, oh, we're on the same side and we should team up to fight the bad guys. So it's arranged in 5 head-to-head battles between different superheroes. I'll just read off the matchups. So you have the Hulk versus Wolverine, Green Lantern versus Iron Man, Batman versus Spider-Man, Captain America versus Mr. Fantastic, and Thor versus Superman. So how did you decide which ones you wanted to focus on, and how did you decide who should be matched up in a battle, an ethical battle against another character?
Right. Well, it takes a few years to put a book together. And so at the time I was assembling the structure of the book, I was thinking about which characters had been made more popular by recent movies. I wanted to make sure that the characters I was dealing with were familiar. So that was sort of a first measure. A second measure was I had to be able to identify in them some core ethical problem or some feature of the human condition that character dealt with or spoke to in a very distinctive fashion. And that meant I had to avoid overlap by picking characters that, more or less sent the same message or too similar a message or had the same problems or fought the same fights, ethically speaking. And then, however, I decided I wanted to pair them up in a way so that in the pairs that I selected, they still shared enough in common that pairing them up meant that they were dealing with some part of the human condition that they shared common, but in different ways. So that I started, as you pointed out, by looking at Hulk and Wolverine, and looked at them as characters who are best known for their animality or their being like beasts, because that's something that we human beings are. We're animals, and our animalistic tendencies are part of who we are, and civilization strives to keep those in check. But they're undeniably part of us, and maybe it's not altogether bad, right? But it's a matter of how do we deal with it, and how do we make use of that part of us. And so Hulk and Wolverine addressed that. And then I looked at us all the way to the last chapter, Superman and Thor, who are godlike characters. And so in classical ethics, human beings are identified as being the sort of the most divine of the beings in this world, or most like the divine or akin to the divine. And there's different traditions that identify human beings as special in this way. And so I thought, well, I'll ascend to that aspect of, or that claim that human beings often make regarding themselves, that either they have something divine about themselves or that they have special favor from the divine, and look at characters that were most like that, and worked our way through different parts of the human condition along the way.
Yeah, I guess I only realized this looking at the table of contents after finishing it, that you have a kind of going from the lower parts of human nature to the highest with the godlike superheroes.
It was hard. I mean, as a longtime comic book reader, it was hard making these choices. It would be a totally different book if it was Travis Smith's favorite characters. Mm-hmm. And Captain Marvel, whose movie is coming out next spring, would be in there and would win because she's my favorite.
Oh, okay. Yeah, the trailer, the second trailer just dropped last night.
I have to find it. I haven't seen it yet. And so, yeah, it would be a totally different book if it was my favorite characters. But I wanted to establish some critical distance from the characters. I didn't want to write 3 cheers, hurrah, hurrah for the ones that I love the most. I wanted to use this as an opportunity to, as I said, think critically about ourselves, our society, our values, myself. And why I like these characters, and whether I should or whether we should like them so much as we do. And so that forced me to, approach characters that weren't my favorite and give them the most generous reading I could, learn more about them, and try to understand why it is that even if they're not my favorite, why are they so beloved? And at the same time, I took some characters that I do enjoy and have enjoyed the most over the course of my comic book fandom, and I decided, are they so admirable? Should I really root for them? Should I find their stories so inspiring, or actually might we be better off by calling into question what makes them so attractive and appealing?
So this will be a detour into comic book nerd questions for this for this one, which is the classic DC versus Marvel. So I'm going to guess you were a Marvel kid. Would that be right?
No, I'm probably about 50-50.
Oh, really? Okay.
I say 45-45 plus other publishers, right? Yeah.
Okay. Well, I started reading in the early '90s, and that was more of a Marvel heyday, and those characters appealed to me more. And for people who don't read comics, DC is the older comic book company, and its characters include Batman, Superman, The Flash, Aquaman, Wonder Woman, Green Lantern in here, and then Marvel is I did an episode about Stan Lee just a couple weeks ago after his death, and his most famous characters are Iron Man, Thor, the Hulk, Spider-Man, and the X-Men. So the kind of the standard understanding of the difference between them is that like the Marvel characters introduced like more humanism into the idea of into the superhero genre, and all these characters had realistic flaws in a way that the DC characters didn't. So Superman's flaw is kryptonite. So that's like, you could say that's a metaphor for different things, but like, that's not like the same kind of flaw that the Hulk has, which is like anger, turns him into a monster, or Spider-Man has this flaw of, like self-doubt and, feeling like he could have stopped his Uncle Ben's death and he didn't, so he always, has that like psychic wound in his personality. And so how did you approach that kind of thing? Did you see any difference between, you have at my count 3 DC, 7 Marvel in here? How did you decide to split it up?
Right.
Why is the Flash not in here?
Right, and I did decide to focus on characters that were in the movies at the time, and Flash hadn't yet made that appearance in the Justice League film that we might wish we could forget about. Yet, although the television series, which I've seen a good portion of, has done a pretty good job of getting what the Flash character represents. And right, I mean, DC has not been having the same success that Marvel has at translating their properties into successful film features. The one preeminent DC character that unfortunately was left out in the book, her movie hadn't been sort of announced yet when I sort of assembled and determined the structure of the book, is Wonder Woman. I do end up making mention of Wonder Woman a couple of times in the book, regretting that she's not included. I do remark that I think she's actually more divine than Superman. And so I think if I were to pick a character I'd pair her against, I would have had to include a chapter of Wonder Woman versus Silver Surfer, who's more divine than Thor. But then I'm going to characters that are godlike, to characters who are actually, divine, even more literal and on the nose way. I mean, you read the early Silver Surfer comic books, and there's the metaphor is thinly veiled. I'm actually currently trying to write a sort of bonus chapter article on Wonder Woman combined with Black Panther, however, taking the angle that those two characters teach us something about the problem of privilege. Wonder Woman being a princess from Paradise Island, Black Panther being a king from sort of a perfect, near perfect society, harmonious society that's been hidden away and kept protected from the rest of the contaminating factors in the world. Both represent characters who almost represent the heights of privilege. And so they represent interesting studies of what it means to use your privilege well, let's say. They illustrate that privilege in and of itself isn't the problem and inherently objectionable. The problem is how are people who are privileged use their privileges. And I think that study of those characters is important, is useful for that effect. But those characters weren't in the book at the time because I had already sort of set the structure of the book. I'm actually looking forward to also writing something about Captain Marvel next year when the movie comes out. Already got something in mind for that too. But right, Wonder Woman, and right, Flash. I mean, once you get to Martian Manhunter, now immediately, although he's been appearing in the Supergirl television show, which I at least enjoyed the first season of, and that's fantastic to see. But again, the book was sort of well underway by the time I might have considered Martian Manhunter, let alone Miss Martian or something like that.
Okay, why don't we look at a couple of the contests specifically? Is there any you want to start with? Or we can just start with Hulk. Why don't we do Hulk versus Wolverine?
Whatever interests you most.
Yeah, let's do Hulk versus Wolverine. Wolverine was one of my favorite characters when I was a kid because I was really into X-Men. That was my focus in the world of mid-90s comics. So Wolverine, Hugh Jackman plays him in the X-Men movies and all these other associated movies. So probably people know the character basically, and the Hulk is probably one of the most iconic comic book characters, and everyone knows who he is as well. Yeah. So what are their virtues and moral failings?
Right. Well, you brought up anger, right? And everybody knows that the Hulk gets more powerful the angrier that Hulk gets. And at the beginning of the old 1970s TV show, they would focus on the word anger at the beginning of the theme, and then they'd zoom out, and it would be the part of the word danger. And so that's a major theme in Hulk. But what I decided to focus on was the way in which the Hulk represents our individualism. Because one of the things that the Hulk is repeatedly saying is Hulk just wants to be left alone, right? Which is to me more interesting than the Hulk has to struggle with his anger. Because we live in a sort of individualistic, liberal society in which, for many good reasons, we've learned to emphasize our private lives and our private rights. We see ourselves as engaged in voluntary associations, whether at the level of society or the level of the state, that we enter into as individuals by nature. We have our own goals. We're not bound by. We're not born to particular stations in our lives, but we see ourselves as having social mobility as individuals. But it's also the case that, and I saw one of your recent interviews. You had a guest on talking about the homebodies economy. Remember, right?
Yeah.
Increasing tendency to retreat into ourselves and our own lives, even if we live through our virtual friendships on our devices. The ability to, suppose, and the degree to which our culture and our policies sort of encourage us to think of ourselves as principally individuals, and to go from a live and let live. I mean, live and let live is great so that we're not, persecuting heretics or something, out of, the presumption that somehow we're supposed to meddle in everybody's lives in every way in order to make them, better, to save their souls or something, right? The doctrine of toleration was founded in early modern thought for good reason. But at its excesses, individualism, this sort of gets to the idea that, if only I could be totally left alone and I didn't have any obligations to anybody else and nobody had any expectations of me, then I could do whatever I wanted and enjoy whatever I wanted and would never be bothered. And then we get to the how dare anybody interfere with my life or try to meddle with my life in any way. Sort of attitude that, taken to an extreme, gets to the the Hulk-like quality of not only leave me alone, but the other part of it is the Hulk's always is talking about how he's the strongest one there is, and taking great umbrage whenever anybody challenges his strength, which I metaphorically read as a tendency of the isolated individual to also sort of in a sort of tyrannical way demand respect for their superlative qualities. Everybody's got to be recognized as awesome as they think themselves to be, with the "or else" often being appended to it. How dare you not acknowledge me for being as great as I am? Because anytime anybody might criticize you or suggest that you might live differently, it is a suggestion that you're not only not as good as you could be and should be for yourself, but that somebody else knows better than you who you should be. That violates our egalitarian individualism, and people get outraged by that. And I think we see online an awful lot of that sort of, how dare you criticize me? How dare you not take me to be as awesome as I say I am? And
yeah,
so
I think maybe the Hulk is the patron saint of Twitter.
Right.
Because people like to people go on Twitter in order to get angry, because for some people it feels really good to be angry and righteously angry, and then they lash out, and then they go back to I assume they go back to their everyday lives. Maybe they're still angry, maybe the anger did flush from them, and they're like Bruce Banner returning to everyday life, and the Hulk is their online persona.
That's right. I mean, Aristotle points out that mildness is his virtue, and mildness is how you deal with things that would make you angry. It's not never being angry. It's the right amount of anger under the circumstances that helps you deal well with the situation that angers you. And there can be deficiencies and there can be excesses in this, but there's like every virtue, there's Aristotle would say there's a pleasure that comes with that virtue, or in the way in which we try to deal with that part of our soul, or the situations in our lives that affect that part of our soul. And so getting angry in the right way is pleasurable. And especially when you can succeed at acting in response to that anger, that success brings you pleasure. Dealing well with the things that anger you is a pleasurable thing. Now, of course, the way we feel anger and the way we react to anger, the way we assess how angry we should be given a situation, is something that external forces can influence us and shape us. And we can be cultivated poorly with respect to this part of our soul. We can be made to be much too outraged by too many things too easily, too readily, and then to savor that anger too much, and then more to take great pride in and pat oneself on the back excessively for the successes in reacting and destroying or demolishing, or as the Hulk would have it, smashing those who made you angry. And so there is a tendency, I think, for people to feel pleased with themselves for getting excessively outraged, especially if their outrage destroys the object of their outrage. And yet Twitter doesn't help us in that regard very well. Wolverine, I don't know if I, just as a counterpart.
Well, I have one Hulk note to make. I was thinking of, I guess I hadn't, the Hulk sense of isolation, like in the 70s version of Hulk, it was kind of like he was going around the country and helping people out and stuff. I was thinking, what you said reminded me of the...
Now I've got the Lonely Man theme going on my back of my head as David Banner hitchhikes down the street.
Right. Yeah, he was David Banner in that version for some reason. But the Hulk movie that Ang Lee made that came out around 2002 or so...
it has a roided out poodle in it, yes.
It was a strange movie. It was strange for Ang Lee, who had directed Sense and Sensibility or something, to make this superhero Hulk movie, and it didn't get... This was before they launched the Marvel Cinematic Universe or whatever with Iron Man, so it was kind of just forgotten, and I don't think it was a blockbuster. But it was very striking visually, and the thing that there's two scenes that became semi-iconic. One was the dream where Bruce Banner just took a shower and the mirror is fogged over and he wipes it with his hand, and on the other side is the Hulk, and the Hulk is just using one giant finger to wipe it. So he's seeing the Hulk within, but then the other one was the CGI scene of him. He's in the Southwest desert somewhere, and he's bounding from giant rock to giant rock and soaring through the air. And this was impressive computer graphics for 2002 or whatever. But it also was just kind of thrilling visually to see this giant figure who's human but not human, and he's overleaping in a certain way. But so the Hulk wants to be. He wants to be by himself, but he wants to be by himself because he can't be in a city. Because if he's in a city and becomes the Hulk, then he kills people and destroys buildings and causes havoc. So it's like he wants to. It's like self-abnegation for the Hulk to be left alone. In the original comic, he is irradiated by gamma rays because he's trying to work at a nuclear test site. And he tries to save some kid who like wanders into the test site, who later becomes his sidekick, kind of. So it's like he does like a selfless act, and then he's like cursed with this power that makes him super strong, but he doesn't, he just wants to be Bruce Banner. He doesn't want to be the Hulk. They change the character multiple times. Sometimes he's always, sometimes he's smart, sometimes he's stupid, sometimes he's always the Hulk, other times he's gray. But in the original conception, it's like it is like a tragic tale.
Trying to find the ethical core of a character is difficult when they go through so many iterations over the decades. And a character like the Hulk is especially needful of this because the concept's so basic, right? So I think in order to keep the stories fresh, they're always, coming at it with a different angle. I don't know if it was entirely selfless. In my argument, Bruce Banner, sort of when he saw Rick Jones at the bomb site just about at the time of the detonation, might have then finally realized what he had done. I point out the sort of the problem that technology poses for us ethically is a recurring theme in the book, and it sort of first emerges in my discussion of the Hulk. Bruce Banner kind of also represents the scientific person that is extraordinary when it comes to thinking about the theoretical side of things, but sometimes can be on the oblivious side when it comes to the practical consequences or implications of the very things that their inventiveness and their brilliance can generate. A sort of character type that Sheldon has made very familiar, I think, on the TV in recent years. And I think Bruce Banner finally had a sort of moment of insight that, oh my God, this thing might kill people. This bomb that was designed to kill cajillions of people might actually kill someone. And was confronted with that sort of shock that when you read histories of the Manhattan Project, you get accounts of some of the scientists that developed the first atomic bomb were surprised to find it would actually get used and appalled. This was just a really interesting physics problem that we all got these geniuses together to solve, wasn't it? In the middle of wartime, at least, The Ang Lee version is interesting to me because part of what happened, especially in the 1980s to 90s run of the Hulk, was to try to absolve Bruce Banner of responsibility. So this saying it's his dad's fault that he turned out this way, he's a sickly child who is in isolation tents as a baby and things like this. All these things go to explaining why he has this character. And therefore you can't blame him for Hulk. What became more interesting in more recent Hulk comics is Bruce Banner taking responsibility more for himself and refusing to accept multiple personality theories in order to render himself not responsible, and instead to take full responsibility. That's another recurring theme in superhero ethics, is how superhero stories are remain one of the parts of our culture that still emphasize responsibility as a theme, emphasize individual responsibility, interpersonal responsibility, how we treat each other, how we come to each other's aid, and try to take care of our neighborhoods, to use the word that Spider-Man always brings to mind. Yeah.
Yeah, I had that thought too, while reading it. These characters, they didn't need to don the mantle of a secret identity and use it to fight crime and villains and try to, make the world better. Like that was a choice. They could have just done whatever. Maybe the Hulk is kind of an exception because his powers are like out of control. But I
end up saying that Bruce Banner is more of a hero than the Hulk is.
Yeah, but yeah, it's and then compared to maybe some of the virtues that we exalt today, it's not always selflessness and putting others first. Okay, so why don't we go to Wolverine, the character that you contrast with the Hulk?
Right. I talk about how as animalistic Wolverine is. He reminds us that one of the things that makes us distinctively human is our concern for honor. And Wolverine in particular is sort of ill fit within modern liberal democratic technological commercial society where we have deliberately suppressed concerns for honor, which again is a good thing because we don't want to be having duels in the streets over the slightest slight. And we do tend to find that codes of honor tend to be extremely inegalitarian and allow for all kinds of systems of domination to be imposed and sustained unjustly. And we recognize that codes of honor are conventional. They're part of our society that is socially constructed. And so there are a number of reasons why modern society has sort of tried to treat considerations of honor as less important to us as a vanity or things that we shouldn't take so seriously. But we can't get rid of these concerns in our lives, concerns about integrity, duty, reputation, recognition. These are all parts of the intangible goods that human beings are sort of, let's say, naturally concerned with, even if all of our standards of those are artificial. Wolverine starts looking for other kinds of society that still take codes of honor seriously. That's why he's always going up to the wilderness and the Arctic, where there are tribes of people who still have honor codes that are significant for governing their ways of life, or going to Japan, which in our imagination retains this sort of mythological quality as the society of honor and nobility, even if historical Japan at its worst is something that the West has long used as an example of honor codes. The tendency of societies too governed by honor codes to become scary in different ways, and so, but still, those kinds of societies have a certain appeal to us that speak to the fact that this part of our soul has been suppressed, and Wolverine reminds us of how important it is to keep these considerations in mind and not merely be hedonistic, not merely only seeking advantage and profit as commercial society would encourage us to. And so that's a theme that I think is important to Wolverine. Now, of course, as I was saying, consideration for honor can be excessive as well. And I also like to use the internet example, as I did with the Hulk, with Wolverine, as Wolverine is principally motivated to defend his tribe, the mutants, who are always feared and hated and under attack, and at the risk of existential threat. And so Wolverine's concerns, I think, are mirrored today in the ways in which people not only have that reaction on social media, which is I demand to be recognized as awesome as I am, but how dare you deny me my superlative adjectives, but rather how dare you pose a threat to my group or the groups that I defend. And to stand for the honor of a group that is in need of defending is something that Wolverine represents. And I think one of the reasons why he remains as appealing as he is, despite the evident, let's say, toxic masculinity that oozes from his every pore in his extremely hirsute body. Yes.
Right. Yeah, there's a lot of interesting things there. So Wolverine is a mutant, and he's a member of the X-Men, and so he's an outsider in the world of Marvel Comics. The populace is scared of mutants and doesn't, sometimes tries to genetically reprogram them or send them to an island or something, so we don't have to deal with them. So the outcast. When I kind of stopped reading comic books around right before they did they explained the origin of Wolverine. So through my childhood, he was this mysterious character. Usually in comic books you see the origin of a character right away. Wolverine, they didn't explain the origin for decades, and it turned out that he's 300 years old or something. So he has old fashioned values because he was born in 1800, and he
comes from a different era of Canadians.
Right. So he's not American.
Beer drinking, body checking, tree cutting, wilderness braving. Canadians, and not the sort of Canadian that our current prime minister can.
Right. So you're broadcasting from inside the nation of Canada right now. Yeah, it is interesting to think why exactly was it Chris Claremont who created Wolverine? Why they decided to make him Canadian?
Claremont didn't create him. But Claremont's the sort of Claremont Byrne era of Uncanny X-Men sort of really popularized him.
Right, okay, yeah, that makes sense. He appeared first in a Hulk comic, if I'm not mistaken. And yeah, so he had this outsider. He has this funny hair. He's short, which in most of these comic book characters, the guys are all like 6'2", and Wolverine is short. And then he has his adamantium skeleton and claws, and his mutant powers is healing factor. So you find out at some point that he wasn't born with adamantium claws. He was born with bone claws, and he was subjected to a scientific experiment called Weapon X, and they gave him this unbreakable skeleton. So the other thing about him is he, you can't keep him down. Like, you can throw whatever at him, and he'll still keep on going because of his skeleton and his healing. So pairing him with the Hulk is interesting because I'm sure at some point they were matched up for a fight or something, and no matter how many times the Hulk smashes Wolverine, he's still ticking. I think the ethic, the kind of idea that he, he's kind of like the character type is like a cowboy, like a lone cowboy, or like the samurai or something in those Japanese stories. Some may have even had samurai in the title. But he sometimes he'll just he has a motorcycle and he'll just go away from the X-Men, and he's done with them for a while and needs to retreat into the woods of Canada. And I think it is an interesting example of he's kind of roguish, but he also has a moral core to him, and you definitely want to be his friend. You don't want to get on his bad side.
There's never a time Wolverine's walked into a bar that didn't result in a brawl.
Right. Yeah. So he has some anger issues also, clearly, if we pairing him with the Hulk.
Now, the points you brought up are interesting. I mean, he's both. You can say he's a victim of both nature and nurture. He's somebody who was sort of born into circumstances with his unusual condition that's going to make him an outcast, put him at a disadvantage in that way. His family situation in his childhood is not good, and throughout his life, he's always looking for a community to belong to, but he can't really belong for long, so he's always having to leave and find a new place or return later. But this idea that he's been a victim of all kinds of mistreatment. People have meddled with his body and his mind so repeatedly that people have used him for their own purposes in terrible ways many times. That it's interesting that he's the character who has sort of integrity as a theme, because his body and mind have been destroyed and rebuilt so many times it's hard to know who the real him is, and this has been part of his story. He doesn't know who the real
So his mind was wiped at some point, and he doesn't remember his real name. He's been
meddled with, let's say, physically, mentally, many times.
Yeah, so kind of like a Jason Bourne, it's a similar theme.
In the Logan movie, which is excellent, he tells his clone daughter Laura, "Don't be what they made you," which I think is an important ethical theme that Wolverine represents. A lot of superheroes have this in them because they often have some sort of tragic past, or they were the victim of some mistreatment or some misfortune, and they have to learn to nevertheless take responsibility for themselves and become the best version that they can be of themselves, and that involves coming to the aid of others, both like themselves and not, in order to be the best, most responsible version of themselves. And Wolverine really represents that to a great degree, given how much he's been a victim of over the course of his life, and how other people have tried to define him, and he refuses to be what other people have tried to make him into, and he refuses to be defined by the ways in which other people have abused him. Now, the healing factor is interesting, though, because as sort of all these ways in which Wolverine is representing parts of the human condition that modern society has suppressed, our animalistic side and our concern for honor, right. I mean, he does sort of pander to our modern desire for invulnerable bodies or the capacity to heal from anything, our sort of infatuation with medical technology and our desire for medicine to be able to save us from anything and everything, our hope and expectation that we should not be vulnerable to suffering from illness, disease, and wounds. Wolverine, sort of appeals to us precisely because he doesn't suffer in these ways. Of course, one could reflect then maybe that this is something that compromises his courage, though, since in the end, it's he must know how hard he is to kill.
Right. Although it's made clear that he feels the pain. He feels the pain. So it's not like Superman, where the bullets bounce off his chest and it's nothing.
And I'm somebody who understands sort of what you have to deal with pain every day, and
every time once it's revealed that the claws are like part of his skeletal structure. Whenever he pops them out, he feels them popping out. It's just that the skin heals instantly, and so he suffers. He's definitely one of the most like suffering of the like big superheroes. Why don't we jump to a different pairing, and that would be Batman versus Spider-Man.
Sure.
So the kind of one thematic link between these two characters. I mean, they're both iconic, but they both are very heavily identified with specific cities. New York City for Spider-Man, the imaginary Gotham City, kind of based on New York City for Batman. So what are the virtues of these two iconic characters?
Well, I look at them as asking what kind of relationship should we have and responsibility do we have to our communities. Right. And so if Hulk and Wolverine especially represent the idea that you'd have to, on the extremes of the book, the old Aristotelian idea that you'd have to be a god or a beast to be self-sufficient. So I deal with beast-like characters in the first chapter and god-like characters in the final chapter. But if we're social animals, what's our proper relationship to, and how should we take responsibility for our place in our communities? And Spider-Man and Batman are interesting to compare because Batman, as it were, comes up from the cave from below. Spider-Man descends from the skies, as it were, on his web lines or on lamp posts. However, Batman is the kind of person who represents the aspiration to, through the imposition of our willpower, our righteous intentions, our technological means, to try to willfully impose a rational and moral order on our communities from above. To try to combat the apparent inherent chaotic or tragic nature that spontaneously left to themselves they inevitably devolve into and continue to represent. If Batman had the powers of a Superman, it would be hard for a Batman to resist trying to reorder the world. And recent story actually published last month had Superman offer Superman powers to Batman to see if he would take them, and Batman sort of knows better than to take them, even though he knows. There have been other stories in which sort of Batman admits that if he had Superman's powers, he would impose a order on the world, but he's glad that he doesn't have them. And so this desire for rational control and the idea that we could impose a moral order on society if only we had the resolve to do so by someone that intelligent and that with that much means at his disposal. Batman represents that, where Spider-Man actually represents the sort of idea that instead of a top-down attitude towards society, society is formed from the bottom up. That it falls to each of us to the best of our ability with the powers that we have. And Spider-Man has these extraordinary powers, but I tend throughout superhero ethics to read superpowers metaphorically. How do they represent actual abilities that actual human beings have, or at least wish they had? But how do we use the extraordinary abilities that we as human beings have in our neighborhoods, in our communities, to the best of our ability, and on a case-by-case basis, as it were, with as much resolve as possible? It requires a bit of guilty conscience, in Peter Parker's case especially, to overcome the tendencies in our culture to convince people that they should just take care of themselves instead, and that would be fine. But right, to take sort of responsibility for oneself without trying to take total responsibility for everybody else for their own good. And so I contrast those two heroes in that way.
Yeah, I think I found this comparison, or this pairing, the most interesting in the differences between these two characters and the similarities. So they're both a bat and a spider, both kind of like vermin characters. So they have that in common. I think so out of the 10, you have a Batman. Batman doesn't have any supernatural or like extra normal powers in the reality of the comics. He is just like he's really, really smart, and he's trained his body to be like the ultimate in like human perfection, and but he can't fly or breathe underwater or run super fast or anything. Like he is still a man. Whereas these other characters have powers that couldn't exist in this world. But no one could actually be Batman. But you could kind of like see yourself in like, well, he's just this guy who like worked really, really hard at working out and figuring stuff out, and he has all these inventions and stuff. Yeah, so and then what is Spider-Man's like appellation is he's the friendly neighborhood Spider-Man. Batman definitely not friendly. He doesn't have a specific neighborhood. He's all of Gotham, whereas like Spider-Man is kind of like he grew up in Queens, this real place, versus Gotham, this imaginary place that's like a scarier version of New York City. And Batman is like really serious usually. I mean, there's different versions of the character, but kind of humorless and dark.
When he does tell jokes, most of his jokes have as their punchline, "Remember how smart I am," right? So that's every joke he tells reminds you that he's smarter than you.
Right, and the Christopher Nolan trilogy of Batman movies are grim and gritty. Not funny. There was more silliness associated with the character before, with the Tim Burton and the Adam West, and that. So Spider-Man is like, he quips and he tells jokes, and they're silly, and he'll tell a joke as he's punching a villain out or something, and so he's kind of like a child, teenager, young adult usually, and he kind of retains that youthfulness, whereas Batman, like his central, the character was created through childhood trauma of the parents being killed in front of him, and then there's also the trauma of Uncle Ben being killed and Spider-Man not stopping him. So there's all these interesting like some commonalities, some contrasts. The last thing I would mention is, I think Batman has the best like villain pairing in comics, because he's paired with the Joker as his chief villain, and the Joker is everything. Life is a joke to him, but also he's kind of like the there was a line that became kind of famous from the second Nolan Batman movie that like there's some men who just want to watch the world burn, and that kind of like nihilism and insanity contrasts very, very well with the like ultra rational, like logical detective of Batman. So you have rationality posed with irrationality. I think that's the best like thematic contrast between hero and villain in comics.
I mean, I talked about sort of looking at them from a social-political perspective, but if we look at them from the point of view of the cosmic perspective of what is the universe really like, in a certain sense, both Spider-Man and Batman are premised on the idea that naturally the cosmos is tragic. How do we react to this? And I see Batman as representing the attitude that we see in early modern thought, especially in the likes of someone like a Francis Bacon, the founder of the technological project, philosophically, let's say, or one of the founders. That the universe doesn't have final and formal causes in it. It doesn't have purposes, but it has a certain kind of impersonal order to it that we can rationally understand. And then if we impose our wills upon it creatively, we can then reorder the world rationally. And so despite the fact that it's got this sort of tragic basis, which whether it's in your Francis Bacon, your Machiavelli, or your Hobbes, you see as a premise, you see, but nevertheless, it's got enough reason, it's got enough order to it that we can apply our reason to it and reorder it, and then establish the possibility of justice. We can fix the world with our reason. Where I see Spider-Man as representing the idea that the most rational way to deal with the recognition that the universe is tragic is to reconcile ourselves to it. And only then is the possibility of comedy arise. Comedy and tragedy are parasitical on each other, flip sides of the same thing. And so I think it's suitable that Spider-Man is the most comical of the superheroes, because that's how someone from a tradition that recognizes the tragedy of the universe and the impossibility of human beings to rationally fix it, have to reconcile themselves to it. And therefore, wit is essential to civility. Wit is essential to happiness. Wit is essential to as much justice as we can have among ourselves in this world that will never be perfectly just. And that's why I think, however, Joker is a well paired with Batman. Because when you're the kind of person that believes that we could and should have a perfectly just order, all we have to do is want it enough and try hard enough. And if only we wanted it enough, had enough imagination, tried hard enough, then we could finally fix everything, and there'd be no more tragedy, and there'd be no more suffering, and there'd be no more injustice. When you're that kind of person, they tend to be humorless. They tend to be more outraged by any attempt at humor. Right? Jokes become offenses, inherently objectionable. If only people got on board with the project and put all of their own energies into fixing things like we know they can and should be, then we'd have it fixed by now. And so humor becomes an affront when you're determined to fix everything. Because it represents a lack of faith in our ability to control, master, fix everything, set everything right. Now, Joker represents an excess of this, of course, right? He represents the partial truth that Batman's perspective leaves out, and then takes it to an extreme where he doesn't just make jokes like Spider-Man does, but he becomes nihilistic, right? And he himself takes excessive pleasure in not only witnessing but causing great tragedy and great suffering through his mischief. As a sort of the modern technological project stands on a sort of nihilistic precipice or an abyss, as someone like Nietzsche or Kant recognized, and I think Joker represents the person who not only is aware of that, and Batman's aware of it too, but revels in it or jumps in the abyss, lives in it, becomes the monster that staring into the abyss might make one. And so that said, there's something extremely comical about Batman as well, the fact that Batman always wins. Right? Paired with Superman, Batman and Superman, the world's finest, kind of represent the two theatrical masks of comedy and tragedy, where Batman is the grim, tragic mask and Superman is the smiling mask. but still there's something extremely comical about Batman and the way in which Batman always wins, even against people who are way more powerful than him. And so you represent
even Superman when they face off.
Yeah, for sure. And it's a piety. Who wins any fight, Batman versus blank? The answer is always Batman. But that's human beings patting themselves on the back because we say he's the most human character, so we want him to win all the time so that we can believe that we're capable of winning all the time, which is consistent with the conceit that I've said Batman represents. So there's something comical about Batman that he always wins, but also, let's say, Sisyphean about it because he always wins, but Gotham City never gets any better. Every episode of the animated series, every comic book featuring Batman starts off with Gotham as corrupt as it ever was, and people's lives in as much danger as they ever were. Yeah.
Yeah, and the bad guys always manage to break out of Arkham Prison.
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned that because the fact that Batman sends them to an asylum rather than to a prison really speaks to this idea that he thinks that our rational techniques should be able to fix everything. The idea that if only we could, medicalize their evil properly and apply the correct psychiatric techniques, then they'd be fixed. Is an extreme sort of version of the modern hope that reason, technology can fix everything, rather than Spider-Man just leaves them on the lamppost dangling in webs to be carted away by the very same boys in blue that will shoot at him whenever they happen to see him, because they are always, the tragic part of Spider-Man is that he's always, is he a threat or a menace, right? He's very rarely recognized as the hero that he is. He represents what I say in Plato's Republic, the man of perfect justice who always does the right thing but always gets a reputation for doing the wrong thing. He tries to stop a bank robbery and he's always accused of being, complicit with, the thief.
Yeah, and J. Jonah Jameson, the editor of the Daily Bugle, is the one who wants photos of Spider-Man and wants to always portray him as a menace. There's one other kind of theme between these two characters that I want to touch on briefly, which is the family ties. So they're both orphans. Batman, young Bruce Wayne, watches his parents be murdered, and that's what sets him into his life as a superhero. And he's raised by his butler, Alfred, we can guess. I don't know of any other relatives in the Wayne family who helped him out. Spider-Man is introduced as being raised by his aunt and uncle, and he inadvertently causes his uncle's murder by not stopping a robber when he had the chance. So then his central family connection is to Aunt May. And he has to make sure Aunt May doesn't find out who he really is. And besides the tragedy of Uncle Ben, the other great tragedy that happens in the initial run is his girlfriend is killed, Gwen Stacy, and he plays a part in that as well because the Green Goblin throws her into the river, and he shoots a web out to try to catch her, and it causes her to snap her neck back, and she dies. And who is the Green Goblin? It's the father of his best friend. So the kind of, everything connected to him, the people most closely connected to him, either by family, friendship, or love, all of these tragic dimensions to them. And then as the comic went on, it became more and more absurd that he's living with Aunt May, and he ends up with kind of a happy marriage to Mary Jane. But yeah, I do think it's an interesting contrast that like Batman ends up being an isolated person. He spends his time in the cave. When he's in his civilian identity, he's a playboy, but he never gets married. I think they just did something where they're was he finally going to marry Catwoman? But then I read something that said that they decided not to get married in the end because
as it were.
Because could Batman have a wife? It doesn't make sense. But Spider-Man could have a wife, and as far as I know, and they reboot these characters so often, still does. The
Batman of Earth 2 pre-Crisis did marry Catwoman, and he had the most pathetic death of all. An ordinary criminal took him down. and I think suggesting that Batman can't be Batman if he knows love.
Right. So, yeah. So, like,
and actually, one of the better Batman movies is the animated one from the '90s, the Mask the Phantasm.
Oh, yes, I do remember that one.
And that's the lesson at the end of it, that Batman can't be Batman if Batman knows love, which might lead us to a discussion. I don't. Of Chapter 4, where I talk about Mr. Fantastic, the superhero who most knows love in his life, and so on. But right, yeah.
Yeah. Well, we've got about an hour. Do you want to do one more pairing, or should we wrap it up?
It's up to you, Aryeh. At this point, I'm sure anybody who's still watching already also has read all of these stories and is right there with us. And I'm really looking forward. One of the things I like about your website are the comments sections, and comic book readers and fans sort of telling each other why we're wrong is our Olympic sport. So I'm looking forward to seeing all the ways in which your viewers tell me which issue I forgot in which series that would have proved everything I've said wrong.
Right. Well, I have to say there was I did, after Stan Lee died, I had here of the New Republic on to talk about kind of the origins of Marvel Comics, and did Stan Lee really deserve as much credit as he's gotten, or did Jack Kirby deserve it? And I think one of the first comments is something like, "Oh, why are we talking about these childish things? Like, how about talking about Rousseau or something?" So we have both now. We're talking about comic books and we're talking about philosophy. So please.
My idea here is, I think, a couple of things, both philosophically and sort of politically, or from the perspective of cultural criticism. Plato didn't have any problem talking about the Homeric stories when he wanted to go about making his philosophical arguments. He took the myth seriously. These are the stories that the people in the culture that he's addressing think are most important for understanding what's true, what's real, what's admirable, what's beautiful. And if you want to have a discussion with people about these subjects, start where they are. Find out what they care about, what they like, and what they believe in, and have a discussion that starts from those premises, and treats them with respect. And insofar as in our culture today, the superheroes are sort of principally American cultural invention, but they obviously speak to the human condition more generally, for them to take off as a global phenomenon, as they did even before the movies, but now especially with the movies. And they do tell us stories about right and wrong. They do tell us stories about who should be our role models and who should we imitate, who should we admire. What would we be like if only we were, if we used the powers that we have in ways that we forget to and neglect. And so stories about heroes are always central to understanding any culture and its values and its likely trajectory, to understand what's admirable about it and what's flawed about it. And so I think that doing this isn't just merely, it is fun to go to the comic store on a Wednesday and have an argument over a writer or an artist, or who would win a fight between characters. But superhero ethics was written based on the idea that, we make a mistake if we neglect even what look like merely juvenile amusements as unimportant and just popcorn fun. To totally to totally neglect or surrender the analysis of popular culture artifacts to those who have the power to manufacture them, or others who would interpret them, I think is a mistake. If you want to take seriously, try to understand how children are being raised, or what people think is important in life, or who they would. People still contain within them the impulse to be heroic, or if not to be heroic themselves, to admire heroes, or to give great power to those who presume to be heroes. And so I think that it's not entirely frivolous to ask these kinds of questions of these characters and ask what they represent in our lives and our society.
Yeah, I fully endorse that. In this previous episode, looking back on Lee's legacy, and if we take Lee, Kirby, and Dicko as a one unit in the way that we would talk about the Beatles or something, I think that unit is comparable to Greek and Roman myths and Shakespeare and the Bible in terms of like how creating these characters that embody ideas that are like readily interpretable by like later generations. We keep on returning to these. We keep on returning to Shakespeare. We keep on returning to the Greek myths. I think we're going to keep on returning to Spider-Man and Iron Man for a long time as well.
A lot of people who went into the business of telling these stories, whether as writers or artists, were well read. Whether it's in classical literature or biblical traditions or histories and mythologies, etc. And they put these to use. Sure, they told stories that could be accessible as children's literature originally, let's say, or predominantly. But even then, we know that it was always the case that children's literature would often contain elements that only the adults get. And are when well written are intended to communicate insights that children can't understand directly, but might absorb and comprehend through metaphor, through story, through narrative. And I think that in many ways, as enlightened as we've become in the 21st century, there are ways in which people in past generations were in some ways better educated to history, to the classical literature, and that the authors, the creators of these stories were familiar with these traditions, and they counted on, I think, even their audience being familiar with them too. I tend to find this all the time looking at various popular culture artifacts from the post-war era, that they look like they're naive, they look like they're simple, they look like they're squeaky clean. But you scratch the surface on them a little bit. My wife and I were listening to Buddy Holly music recently, and I can't believe how dark Buddy Holly music is. It's very dark. It sounds like it's happy and chirpy, and it's got but the messages in those songs are dark and disturbing. And a lot of pop culture artifacts have that quality. You watch stand-up comedy from the era before Saturday Night Live, and the degree of literacy that the material could depend upon watch stand-up comics on the Tonight Show and the Johnny Carson years, and the amount of cultural literacy that the comics expected their audience to have in order to get smart jokes was so far in excess of what comedians in the post-90s era depend on. We can't depend on anybody knowing anything anymore sometimes. Right?
Right. Well, I guess the complaint would be like, well, all people know about are Star Wars and Harry Potter and Spider-Man and stuff. But this is not an original sentiment. Like this is the modern mythology that draws the culture together. Like, okay, maybe people aren't reading the Romantic poets in the way they would have 50 years ago. But there's other like commonalities of culture that draw people together, and like there's a reason that Harry Potter is pretty much universally beloved. I mean, it's for children. People read it as children, and then it stays with them because they have a nostalgic affection for it. But it's there's stuff there for adults as well, and it's people can really identify with these things. I think online has helped that, where people can say like, put in their Facebook or Twitter bio that they're a Hufflepuff or a Ravenclaw or whatever, and that gives them like a sense of self-definition and solidarity with other people out there who also think that they're a Hufflepuff or a Ravenclaw. And the way that people, I mean, when I first started reading comics, it was slightly before the internet era, so maybe like 92 or 93. And one of my friends read comics also, and when I would go to the comic store, my other friends would kind of be like, "Oh, he's doing this stupid thing. He's going to the comic store. We got to wait for him outside because we don't want to go to the comic book store." And then the first like online community one I participated in when I was like 12 or 13 was an X-Men bulletin board on AOL. And I made some friends there who I'm actually, we connected on Facebook, 10, 15 years later. So yeah, these things are cultural commonalities. There's a lot of silly parts about superheroes and comic books, but
we're allowed to have fun, and even philosophy shouldn't be totally humorless.
Right. Okay. Why don't we? I think that's a better point to end on than going through another pairing. So people will have to buy the book if they want to get the full serving of 5 matchups of 10 characters analyzed total, and then in the final chapter you decide which characters' kind of ethics and morals and perspective is the most worthy to emulate and think about. And I was surprised by which one that was, so people will have to read it to find out. Okay, that's interesting. So superhero ethics, Travis Smith, thank you for coming on. Do you have a website or a Twitter or something that you want to direct people towards if they're interested in finding out more about your work? No,
I don't social media, Aryeh.
Okay, well, maybe that is another point of wisdom in favor of people checking out the book. But thank you for coming on. Thank you to our viewers and listeners, and we'll see you again next time.
Thanks for having me on the show.